Welcome back. There are few outsiders who know more about Darfur than Alex de Waal. He's made the Horn of Africa his life's work. On Thursday, he appeared before the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs in Washington, D.C. on the very question of Darfur. Dr. Alex de Waal joins us now from our studio in Washington. I'm going to be finding out from you exactly what it is you said to the committee and their response. But let's start off with this talk of sanctions. Do you think it'll help?
I think sanctions can help to pressure Khartoum to achieve a goal, provided that goal is well articulated and is something that at the end of the day ultimately is acceptable to the Sudan government. I think the problem with the international strategy, particularly the US strategy at the moment, is that it has put the peacekeeping troops as the centerpiece of the strategy rather than them as a buttress to an overall political strategy.
What do you think they can realistically do?
I think sanctions at the moment are both a blunt and a very modest instrument. If we compare the Sudan government today with the situation of 10 years ago, it's much, much stronger. 10 years ago, it had antagonized almost all its neighbors. It was cut off from the Arab world after agents based in Sudan tried to assassinate the Egyptian president. It had Eritrean, Ethiopian and Ugandan troops on its soil fighting with the Sudanese opposition against the government, capturing towns. And it didn't have many international friends. And it's the budget of Sudan in the late 1990s, the budget of the central government was about $900 million per year. Today, the national budget is well over 11 billion. It's gone up by a factor of 14 or so. It has basically got friendly neighbors. It has a friend in China. And so the types of sanctions that are being proposed will, I suspect, only have a very modest impact. The government is not really afraid of these types of sanctions.
But what about the peacekeeping forces? The government has agreed to an extra 3,000 at this stage. Will that help? And do you think they are in the right role at the moment?
Certainly a more effective and robust peacekeeping force is needed in Darfur at the moment. When the African Union force a couple of years ago was well led, well financed, had 7,000 troops on the ground and had a high morale, it did a really fine job. It patrolled large numbers of areas, it instilled a lot of confidence. That force has been withering. It's withered on the vine, partly because of international neglect. And at the moment it's down to only about 5,000 troops who have low morale, underpaid, often confined to very small areas. A lot more is needed. But having said that, I think it would be a mistake, an illusion to believe that a peacekeeping force is the answer to Darfur. The answer is a political settlement, including a very robust ceasefire. And the most that an international force of peacekeepers can do is to monitor and enforce. It can police a ceasefire. An international force could not police Darfur. It could not, for example, disarm the militias. It could not drive the government out of Darfur. And I think many of the expectations of what international troops could do are extremely inflated.
What role can the government play in bringing peace? There are a lot of accusations of the government supporting the Janjaweed.
The government is really, at the end of the day, responsible for the mess in Darfur. It allowed a rebellion to begin because it had so neglected Darfur. It had allowed the administration to run down. It had armed some groups against others. And then it massively overreacted to the rebellion by arming militia and sending them out to pillage. And really it's lost most of its control, much of its credibility in Darfur, and it needs to get out of this mess. It's not doing a very good job of that. It signed the Darfur peace agreement a year ago, but most of the major provisions have not been implemented, and it continues to do itself a huge disservice by violating some of the basic provisions of that agreement. When the agreement was being negotiated a year ago, the African Union was aware that the Sudan government had painted aircraft in the colors of the African Union. This is called perfidy. It's actually a crime under the Geneva Conventions, and a special provision was written into the peace agreement to stop the government from doing that. The government signed that, and we learned that it is still doing it. So the government really needs to smarten up its act. It really needs to stick to its word. It really needs to show that it is trustworthy if others are to take it seriously.
You said a little earlier that it has now more friendly neighbours than it did in the past, but What is your response to the external interference from Chad, Libya and Eritrea?
The Chadians are deeply embroiled in the war in Darfur. And President Idris Deby basically recognizes that one of his strongest cards is his engagement in Darfur. He does not want to see a settlement in Darfur until his own political internal problems are settled. And given that there is really no political process to resolve those, he is, for the time being, going to carry on meddling in Darfur and supporting the opposition. And much the same is true of Eritrea. Eritrea is playing something of a double game on this. It also doesn't want to see stability amongst its neighbours, Sudan and more particularly Ethiopia, until its own internal problems are settled, which is going to be a very, very difficult thing to achieve. At the same time, it has mended relations with Khartoum at one level, and has been working in cooperation with Khartoum to try and deliver some sort of deal with the Darfur rebels. That hasn't worked. And so the Eritreans are going back to a strategy of more destabilizing Darfur at the moment.
You are one of the world's experts on Darfur. You've spent a lot of time there. What do you think is one of the biggest misunderstandings that people have regarding this conflict?
I think the portrayal of the conflict as Arabs killing Africans is a deep misrepresentation. Certainly there were groups involved in Darfur, some of the Janjaweed groups, who came with an Arab supremacist ideology, and certainly many of their victims, the majority, during the major campaigns of 2003, 2004 were non-Arabic speaking peoples. However, the majority of Darfur Arabs have stayed out of this conflict. They've stayed neutral. And at the moment, a number of the Darfur's Arab leaders are in discussions with the rebels saying, how can we repair our relationships with the non-Arab groups? How can we restore our reputation? And I think one of the implications of the way it's been portrayed in the Western media, and particularly the charge of genocide that's been laid against the Sudan government, implies that this is a conflict entirely along racial lines. It isn't. It's much more complicated than that.
It's been described as a genocide, as you said, as war, as anarchy. Which one is it?
I think it's a mixture of all of them. The type of atrocities that were seen in 2003, 2004 certainly smacked of the systematic attempt to uproot, displace and kill specific ethnic populations. And in the aftermath of that, we've seen the wholesale destruction of a way of life, a traditional way of life in Darfur. And so that is, in a way, a form of genocide. It is the removal of people from their homes, their removal from their traditional livelihoods. And many Darfurians see this as genocide having been inflicted upon them. But more fundamentally, I believe this is a war. It is a counterinsurgency campaign by the Sudan government, and it is a war that has become extremely complicated with multiple different armed groups aligned with one another, a lot of internecine fighting amongst groups on either side, alongside a near complete collapse in law and order. The institutions for administration, for tribal authority, for the police have basically collapsed. So the situation is really quite anarchic. It's extraordinarily complex. And those who believe that there is a simple solution to this are deluding themselves.
Give us an outline what you said to the House Committee on Foreign Affairs in Washington, who you've just addressed.
The first thing that I said was that no one should have the illusion that an international peacekeeping force is the answer. International peacekeeping can only work in support of a political solution. And a political solution is at the moment very hard to achieve. It will take a lot of work. It will be very difficult because the rebel groups are very fragmented. The government has very little reason for negotiating with them seriously at the moment, and there's external interference. And perhaps most fundamentally, a peace agreement in Darfur can only work if there is a credible, comprehensive peace agreement for Sudan. A comprehensive peace agreement was signed a couple of years ago, promising the democratization of Sudan as a whole. Now, many Sudanese are losing confidence in this. They don't think it is actually going to deliver democracy and stability. And if Darfurians think that the comprehensive peace agreement is a sinking ship, what reason do they have to join it? So I was arguing very strongly that attention needs to be put back on the Sudanese problem as a whole to make sure that the national problems of Sudanese are addressed, the comprehensive peace agreement does proceed, that the democratic aspirations of the Sudanese people as a whole can be fulfilled.
Dr. Deval, very briefly, do you think peace can ever be achieved in Darfur?
I'm sure that peace can be achieved. I'm sure the Darfurians want peace, and the key to peace is working in partnership with Darfurians, not imposing peace from outside.
Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Alex Deval, and thank you so much for joining us again here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions, and if you don't know our email address by now, it's insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the entire team, goodbye for now.